Alrighty, we might kick off. We've got a few more people filtering in steadily. But welcome everyone to our second webinar in this series. And it's lovely to have you all with us today. I'm Kavya. I'm part of the education portfolio here at BehaviouWorks, and I will be your host for today's webinar. And we have three wonderful speakers with us today who I will be introducing shortly. Before we continue, I'd like to acknowledge that we are coming to you today from the lands of the Kulin Nation, specifically those of the Bunurong people. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders, both past and present, and any Indigenous members that we may have with us today. So today we have a really lovely session planned for you. Before we get into the content of it itself, it will be nice to give you a bit of an overview of BehaviouWorks and who we are. So next slide, please, Liam. Perfect. So for anyone who's not familiar with BehaviouWorks yet, perhaps this is your first time hearing from us. BehaviouWorks is Australia's largest university-based behaviour change research enterprise, and we have well over 25 PhD qualified staff. I think perhaps a bit more than that now. We were founded in 2011 with the support of various government and industry partners, and since then we've worked on over 700 behaviour change projects. And really our work, this applied behaviour change research, it impacts knowledge, practice and policy, and really focused on creating a thriving and sustainable world. Today's webinar particularly is the second in the webinar series that we've created. And this webinar series is all about behavioural science for impact. In our first session, we explored why exactly behavioural science deserves a seat at the table when we're tackling these really complex problems. And today we're turning our focus to systems. And we're really looking at the potential for behavioural science to do things differently through the lens of systems thinking. Before we continue with our wonderful speakers and before I introduce you to them, a few really minor housekeeping points. So the session is recorded and the recording will be made available to everybody if anyone needs to jump in and out or come back to it for review later on. We will also have time peppered throughout for questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom. So you should see a little box that says Q&A. If you click on it and start entering in questions or comments as we're going along, I will be monitoring it, and all of our wonderful speakers will also be responding to questions at the end of their presentation. So please do chuck in any comments and ideas that you have. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our very first speaker, who is none other than Professor Liam Smith. Liam's the director and the co-founder of BehaviouWorks Australia and is one of Australia's leading authorities on behaviour change. I mean, Liam's sort of extensive track record is there on the slide, but Liam has worked on a variety, dozens and dozens of projects related to biodiversity and inclusion. So without further ado, Liam, over to you.
Thanks, Kavya. Thanks for the introduction. And it's great to be able to talk today about a topic that's really of great interest to us as a research unit, and to really sort of, I guess, challenge our discipline a little bit and try and push us forward. My presentation is a bit of a cook's tour of a bunch of work we've done that have really taken that systems thinking to the work we do. I will focus on one project in particular at the end before I hand over to Lena and Jen, who will talk about some more specific projects we've done. But I guess my presentation is a bit more of an overview. I think one of the important things to be aware of is that behavioural science, you can often conceptualise where we work in terms of or the problems that we work on in terms of having the number of audiences that they have and number of behaviours. And we see problems sort of sit on this spectrum. So very simple problems, few audiences or one audience doing one behaviour, and then really wicked or complex problems such as those that need systems change. Many people need to do many things differently in order to try and help solve that problem. And the challenge really is that the relevance of behavioural theories is really, they work really well when we're really kind of specific about that behaviour, but they don't work so well when we get to that high level and complex and wicked problems. And so essentially what we try and do in behaviour science is squeeze us down to make simple problems instead of really trying to think of it, I guess, a bit more broadly. That's great, and we do great work, and we'll be able to look at some examples of that. but nonetheless, it is a challenge for our discipline. So to talk through just a couple of examples of this is a project that ran in Townsville over a decade ago. It was trying to get households to paint their roofs white or install a pale coloured roof because it's really good for the efficiency of your home. And we only worked on this very peripherally. It's not really a BehaviourWorks project, but it was very successful, right? And this is an overview of Townsville, and we can see, lots of houses have pale or white coloured roofs, and others, the new build has all white. So great outcome in terms of behaviour change. But I guess the challenge with energy at the moment really is that we need much bigger and more significant change. And one of those key changes is what we call a decentralized system. So instead of making energy at a source, whether that be renewables or coal, and it coming to your house and then we use it in a very linear way, we need to actually put the energy systems out into people's houses so that they can generate and store their own battery, their own power. Another one, a great campaign, enormously successful. Again, we weren't involved in this. Was around the Day Zero campaign in Cape Town. They were running out of water. This is their main dam. And they came up with a terrific market campaign with along a whole bunch of behavioural tools that said that we're going to run out of water at this specific time on this specific day. Again, a great behaviour change campaign led to a reduction in water consumption to less than 50 litres per person per day, so incredibly low. But nonetheless, it rained and they still have the same kind of system, when actually what we need is, again, these decentralised systems where we store water in our homes with water tanks, or we use different sources of water for different purposes. So in some ways, these behaviour change tools embed systems. So what I'm going to talk to you today is some ways that we try and do behavioural science better. And I want to emphasize that we haven't nailed this. We're exploring it. We're really interested in it. We are doing a lot of thinking around it. But if you think you're going to solve systemic issues just through taking a behavioural lens, I think you're really going to fall a little bit short. But we can do our discipline better that might help in terms of driving more systemic change. And so the three things I'm going to cover are, how can we think more broadly about why people do the things they do in the first place? I'm going to talk about some behaviours of interest, so some sort of key behaviours we think might be helpful in driving systemic change. And then most of my talk, or the back end of my talk, will focus on particular audiences of interest, so groups of people who we could or should focus on. So as a behavioural scientist, this was something I didn't do early in my career, and it's something I've learned to do over the course of it, which is to really think more systemically about why people do the things they do. And there's many examples of this. This comes from a fellow speaker, actually, the third speaker today, Jen Macklin, who published a paper that really thought about drivers of recycling behaviour through different levels. So there's the micro, the more really individual level. There's the meso, which is the household or physical setting. And then the macro is more about the community and the technical system and geography. This is some work done by Mark Boulay, also in our team, that was about food waste and what drives food waste. And we see, again, there's individual level drivers, there's household, and then there's those that are external. This is some work done by Laura Jennings, a PhD student of mine, just finished. And she's, again, has these similar sorts of drivers, this time around bystander behaviour, saying, yes, there are individual drivers. There's also societal drivers like the discourse around diversity, equity, inclusion, and gender and cultural norms. And then as a fourth example, and I'm just sort of emphasising that we've done quite a lot, this is around repair, so getting electrical items repaired. And we see, again, these multiple levels of drivers. Now, typically, per the slide I presented first, we often think around the very individual or focused level drivers. We don't often think so much around systemic drivers because sometimes people aren't even conscious of them. And so having this broader perspective on why people do things automatically opens up your eyes in terms of, what might need to change. So some particular behaviours that we might want to focus on. The first, I think, and this is probably a really interesting one and one we've done a bit of work on, is around advocacy. This is some work of a piece of work that was led by Angela Dean at the University of Queensland, but we collaborated on. They asked 143 different people, experts, so people that worked as experts, like they were biodiversity experts in some form or other, either in government or in research or in policy. And about what was the single biggest thing or the most impactful thing that communities could do to try and drive better biodiversity outcomes. And we see at the top here, by a significant margin, the most cited or the most behaviour that people most pointed to was around voting for strong conservation policies. That's where they think people can make the big difference. And if you're interested in following up, there's the paper, and because it's recorded, you can go back and find it perhaps later on. Interestingly, we've taken some more work around biodiversity, and Kim Borg, a fellow researcher at BehaviouWorks, has led some work in trying to understand what predicts people being activists or supporting biodiversity policies. The short outcome is age. Younger people are much more happy to be activists, and that's probably no news to anyone. Maybe many of us were in our youth. But also we find some other drivers. We're a little limited in this study about what we could and couldn't do because it came from data from a much bigger study. But nonetheless, exploring the reasons why people do these behaviours and then thinking about how we might target those reasons or encourage people to do more is a work that's needed to be done, so we can hopefully encourage more activism. And there's the link to the paper if you're interested. Consumption is another interesting behaviour. We've certainly done a bit of work in consumption, but oftentimes there are really powerful forces that work against individual consumption, consumers driving systemic change. And certainly that's a point that Jenny's going to make in her talk later on today. And indeed, it's probably one of those notes of caution to say, be wary in the market, as it is known broadly. There are really powerful forces that act often against consumers making choices and then driving change. It can happen, but it's often difficult. And the last thing I thought I'd mention is around gateway behaviours. So this idea there might be some specific behaviours that you want to target that really, if you do them, can lead to pathways that result in really good outcomes, maybe indeed even activism or policy support. Now, we know quite a bit about some gateway behaviours, particularly around some things like, gender violence. Like they're quite well mapped. We see them in drug and alcohol addiction, in criminal pathways. They're quite well known, but I'd argue they're less well known for, behaviours that we might want to see, or for, advocacy behaviours, or for trying to drive system change sort of behaviours. So I guess we know a little bit about the criminal and addiction space, but less about some other spaces. And there's real need to do more work in this space, and particularly adopting ideas around spillover, which some of you may have heard about, which is this idea that one behaviour can lead to another and another. So gateway behaviours might be the trigger point that then lead to a whole sequence of behaviours, but we don't know enough about it. We don't know enough about the mediators and moderators, the things that make the next behaviour happen. All right, so the last sort of thing I wanted to cover today was really to talk about some audiences we could pay attention to. And there's a couple of groups of powerful people that we don't, I think, research enough, and politicians are certainly one. A student of mine, Connor Wynne, looked at a political decision-making. We got access to a whole group of people who are former politicians and former political advisors, and explored an issue to try and understand the decision-making. And he came up with this idea about the wait and see heuristic that politicians use, which basically says, are the voters demanding action? No. Is there much resistance to these things? Yes. Is there political capital to overpower the resistance? The short of it is, generally speaking, we don't see action because the politics really don't allow it, and there's reasons to not put it high on the agenda. The point really here is understanding the way politicians think and act is super important if we want to get systemic change. Boards. This is not an understanding project. This was actually an intervention-based project that BehaviouWorks did several years ago, where we did some simulation training with board members. The project came about because there was an issue with boards not really being assertive enough. Chances are when you unpack problems and you get back to the board, there are people on that board that knew it was a problem but didn't speak up. So the simulation training was really about trying to encourage board members to speak up. And so we intervened with the simulation training with a trained actor, and we were able to show via a cluster randomized control trial that actually works to improve skills and confidence. But we need to do more with boards to understand how they behave and how we can influence them. And business, so this is a doctoral student of mine from quite some time ago who looked at business decision making in the winery industry and why people were making environmental commitments or not. Essentially, it came down to some key actors with a particular passion that often drove those decisions to make environmental commitments and follow through on them. The motivated are a group we don't explore enough. So motivated are terrific for understanding where systems push back. Lauren Brumley, a student of mine, is using the repair of electrical items as a tool for understanding where the system pushes against people. So chances are if you're going to get a pedal repaired, there's all sorts of challenges. But people who are motivated, we can actually use them to sort of diagnose the system and show us where there's problems. Really nice example of this came from some work that Rob Raven, a colleague of mine, did at the Institute, the Demona Sustainable Development Institute, where we're based, around low waste living, where he was able to get a group of people to commit to doing low waste living and then document the issues they had in doing so, a bit like the repair. They came up with lots of suggestions. I won't go through them, but this is the idea that we can use those motivated people to help diagnose systems, and that can be really helpful. The last group, which I want to talk about, which I think are really interesting, and the term really comes from transitions science, which is this idea that societies transition from an A to B, and there are ways and mechanisms and actors in that help that happen. And intermediaries are super important. And this is a group we're working with really heavily in the Energy Upgrades for Australian Homes project, which actually has 5 universities involved and lots of industry collaboration as well. Essentially, there's policies around net zero, Australia's policy around net zero. There are incentive schemes, particularly for battery and solar, which we know are decentralised. That's very positive, and we want to encourage them. So they are in place. And then we have communities, cities and towns, and lots of them right across the system that we want to influence. And these intermediaries can step in the middle of that to help breach that gap and help with transition. And so in this case, we had state government intermediaries, we have local government intermediaries, and we also have community groups who we're working with on pilots to test different tools and mechanisms to try and encourage people to upgrade their homes for energy efficiency. And these intermediaries have direct contact with the consumers themselves. The work we've done here is actually because we're not so much working with the households directly, we're actually working with the intermediaries. We've created personas. They're not a big group, so we can't do sort of traditional statistical typologies or segments. So this time we've done topologies and we've mapped things like what are their values, what are their goals, what are their challenges and pain points and definitions of success for state government, local government, community group. Interestingly, just to look at a couple, these are state government challenges and pain points. These are things they are saying, a bit like the diagnosis of the system, the motivated. They're saying these are the issues that we're having. Again, I won't go into them. But some of these relate to supply chain, and we have supply chain academics on the project who are able to help with solutions. And we have policy group from the University of New South Wales that are able to think about policy solutions to these challenges that are experienced by intermediaries. Again, community groups, we have these other challenges and pain points. They're a little bit different. And we have groups that are looking at models. So what sort of community models work in order to help implement these programs. We have behaviour change, behavioural is involved, and we have some modelers from the CSIRO that think about the technical aspects of what type of interventions or what type of upgrades are going to work best in these situations. The point really of this slide and this last topic around intermediaries is we really need to lean into them, understand their behaviour, what are their challenges and pain points. They often have connection up to the top of the system and to the bottom of the system. So they're working with them can be really useful audience in sort of understanding how we can drive more systemic change. So to recap, the 3 ways, or 3 of many, and there are things that we didn't talk about today, of course, I didn't, we can help is one is I think we can think more broadly and recognise that there are broader drivers of behaviour that aren't just things that happen in between people's ears. There are some particular behaviours of interest, and we focus on advocacy and to some extent consumption and gateway behaviours, and then some really key audiences, particularly the powerful and intermediaries. So on that note, I will finish. I'm happy to answer questions that you pose in the Q&A. but I'm going to stop share. I'm going to hand the presentation over to Lena.
Thank you so much, Liam. It was really wonderful, even though I've been at BehaviouRworks for so many years, to just hear about the variety of projects that we've been involved in this space over the years. Our next speaker is, as Liam said, Lena, who is a researcher in the environment portfolio and is about to complete a PhD on improving hospital waste recycling using behavioural science. Lena has been a part of BehaviouRworks Australia for 11 years now and has a really wonderful snapshot of her PhD to share with us. So, Lena, over to you.
Thanks, Kavya, and thank you for this introduction. And thanks to all of you for being here and listening. I'm excited to be presenting to you. So as Kavya already said, I'm going to present some of the work that I've been doing in my PhD, looking at ways to improve hospital waste recycling. I'm doing this PhD at the Monash Sustainable Development Institute with BehaviouRworks. And so specifically, I'm looking at systems change through mapping behavior. And in my work, I am unpacking the system of hospital waste management using a behavioral lens. And this can really help us that we get a full understanding of what we're actually dealing with before we move on to prioritization and intervention design. So we actually fully understand how the behaviors that we are confronted with in our system or dealing with in our system actually hang together and influence each other. So that's basically what my work is looking at. And for those of you who don't have a medical background like myself when I started working on hospital waste, I'm going to start with a bit of a background on generally what we're talking about and the complexities involved in managing hospital waste as well. So it's probably not coming as a surprise to anyone. Hospitals and healthcare systems create lots and lots of waste. And there's one study that found that 8% of the waste in New South Wales can be attributed to the healthcare system and its supply chain, so quite a lot. And when we're talking about hospital waste or healthcare waste, there's generally two broader categories. One is hazardous waste and one is non-hazardous waste. So hazardous waste is probably what we think of first, like items that have blood on them or items from patients with communicable diseases, or some specific streams as well, like sharps, where you've got your needles, or pharmaceutical waste or waste for medication for cancer treatment. And then you've got the second category, which is non-hazardous waste, which can actually resemble similar to what we find in our households, like it can include food waste and also recycling materials. Again, similar to what we find at home, you can find like cans, bottles, paper in there, cardboard. And then in the healthcare system and in hospitals, there's also specific recycling streams where there's, for example, various plastics types that can be recycled. One of them is sterilization wrap, or sometimes known KimGuard, which is a sterilization material, like wrapping material that keeps instruments sterile. And if that's sorted appropriately, it's and kept like sorted appropriately throughout the entire stream, it's a pretty clean stream that can be turned, for example, recycled into benches. Yes, and then just thinking about the complexities of hospital waste management, just if we compare it to how we manage our waste at home, like usually in our household, we've got members of our household who throw items in the bin, then the content of that bin goes into our wheelie bin. At bin night, that wheelie bin goes out on the street, and then the garbage truck comes and collects everything. It's a reasonably straightforward process. We've got, as far as the actors that are involved, we've got our family members, and also, like in my case, I've got 4 bins outside. Some, depending on where you're living, might only have 3 bins. So it's a pretty straightforward process. Whereas if you compare this to the hospital waste management system, you've got still items being placed in a bin and then eventually the garbage truck coming. But there's a whole lot of steps in between and a lot more actors. So you find, initially a nurse or a doctor might place an item in a bin, and then that bin gets taken to the first location, which is often a collection location on the hallway or in like a special room there, so a dirty utility room. Then the contents of that bin or the bin itself gets taken by, say, a cleaner or a technician to the next location. From there, it's again being picked up by probably another cleaning team, moved to the next location, and so on until eventually it reaches the waste dock and gets picked up by our contractor who deals with the waste. But we've got a lot more actors and streams involved in a hospital. So in my PhD, I was working with the Royal Melbourne Hospital's operating suite. And by just looking at how many actor groups were involved in managing waste from that particular area, from the operating suite, we were dealing with 13 actor groups and 15 streams. And that will vary depending on your hospital, what streams they have. But in that instance, we were dealing with 15 streams and very interconnected behaviors. So the nurse or the doctor who sort waste appropriately at the beginning, they really rely on the cleaners or the technicians to then take that waste appropriately in the next bin and in the next bin, and that 3-level down in the waste stock in the basement, that it's still basically treated appropriately and not all being put back together. And the same way around, like if the waste team don't have appropriately sorted streams, there's not much they can do about it. So there's various actors who all depend on each other for this recycling or this waste management process to work. So it's highly interconnected behaviors in a hospital waste management system. And what adds to the complexity is that we've also got different locations. So as I said, my research is looking at the operating suite, but we've got also other locations in hospitals where, like ICU, the wards, cafeteria. So there's a lot of different locations. And even within locations, you have, like, in a way, sort of sub-locations. For example, in theaters, you've got, like in operating suites, you've got the actual theater where the surgery is happening, but then you've also got setup rooms where the items for the surgery, the instruments, they get prepared. So that's a sort of closed off, like a separate area to this theater. Then you've got the anesthetic bay where the patient gets anesthetic attention prior to surgery. You've got recovery where the patient is going after the surgery to be monitored and wake up. So you've got all these different locations in the operating suite, which need to be looked at in a bit more detail. And I'm going to get to this on the next slide, why this is so important to be really clear about what we're talking about here and where we're talking about. So just looking again at that chain of hospital waste management steps that are involved in getting all the waste sorted into the waste stock. If we're just looking at the very first step here, if we're just looking at the waste sorting behavior, we might, for example, have in the setup room, a nurse who is placing commingled recycling in the commingled recycling bin, so basically doing exactly what we want. But then we find that in the operating theater, that same nurse is placing commingled recycling in the general waste bin. And if we then explore facilitators and barriers to the behavior and are wondering why this is happening, we might find out that in the operating theater, there might just simply be no commingled recycling bins, for example, for a lack of space. So the behavior, like the nurse just simply doesn't have the opportunity to perform the behavior. And so it's really important when we talk about behaviors to be really clear about who is doing what, where, and when. So we have an actor, an action, a context, the where, and sometimes also the time, which is really relevant because if that changes, the circumstances under which we perform the behavior change and our drivers and barriers will change. So it helps to be really specific. And I'm explaining all this because it really sets the context for that unpacking that I needed to do for the hospital waste management system, because hospital waste management, if you just say it like that, it could sound like almost one behavior. But if you take into account all this complexity underneath with the interconnected behaviors, with the different locations, with the different actors, you realize quite quickly that you actually need to look at it much more closely with a magnifying glass to really understand your system. So in my work, I was looking at one hospital. So my system boundaries were one hospital. So it's a very zoomed in version of looking at a system. And the method that I developed there to really understand that system is basically a mapping method. So at the very top, what I've done to understand the waste management of waste originating from the operating suite of my partner hospital, I mapped out all the locations in that operating suite. So the anesthetic bay, the setup rooms, operating theaters, all of those. Then I mapped out which materials were present in those locations and which bins were present. And then I basically followed the bins all the way through the hospital to the waste stock. So where did I find more bins where these materials would then flow to? And by the way, it doesn't matter that you can't read the slide. I know that it's intentional, like it's just to get a sense of what the steps are that are involved. And so We then had an overview of the locations of the different bins and of the materials. What was still missing is basically how those materials flow through the system. And that is where the behaviors came in. So that's the post-its you can see here. And a zoomed in version is that one blue one that you can see now, which is basically saying that anesthetists, they are placing commingled recycling in the commingled recycling bucket in the drawer of the anesthetic trolley. And the second behavior on that post-it is anesthetic nurses doing the exact same thing. So we've got two behaviors to place commingled recycling in the first bin in a particular location in the operating suite. And just thinking back that I said we have about 15 streams to deal with, a whole lot of locations in the operating suite, we ended up with 84 behaviors just at that sorting level of getting items in the first bin. And then there was another 100 behaviors looking at how we get the content of the first bin all the way down to the waste stock. So we've got behaviors like the anesthetic nurse then take the commingled recycling bucket and take it into the bin in the hallway location, empty it and bring that bucket back. Then we've got technicians or cleaners taking the bin from the hallway or the dirty utility room to the next location, and so on. And doing that across all the streams, we ended up with another 100 transport behaviors. So in total, we had 184 behaviors illustrating our waste management process of waste originating from the operating suite in the Royal Melbourne Hospital. And doing it this way, doing it in a mapping approach, really clearly identified how the behaviors are interconnected. And we could really then visually see how we needed to consider behaviors that happened before and happen after in our further project and intervention design. So we didn't end up picking a behavior in isolation and neglected to consider how it is being influenced by previous behaviors and how it is influencing following behaviors. And so just zooming out a bit at what this now can be used, this method, it can obviously be used for behavior prioritization. So you've got 184 behaviors, you can prioritize this down if you wanted to follow a more sort of classic behavior change approach afterwards. You could also leave it at a fairly high level and just add facilitators and barriers to the map as it is. You'd have quite a lot to do because 184 behaviors is a lot. And what you can do as well, so this map is a very magnified version of one system. So we're looking at one hospital and really get very specific behaviors of who is doing what and where. And sometimes some of the behaviors also have a when. Really clearly what is involved in the waste management in that particular hospital. We could now also zoom out to a higher level where we then look at policy influences, legal influences, and map them around it, and other hospitals as well, where we can basically create a bit of a higher level map, which looks at sort of more behavioral systems maps like they're starting to be developed. And Jen is talking about this a bit more. So mine is essentially a magnified version of, or a zoomed in version of one of these behavioral systems maps. And just as a side note, for those of you who don't work with hospital waste and don't work in hospitals and never will, that particular methodology can probably also be used in other contexts. I haven't tried this in any research yet, but I reckon it's applicable to any context where you've got an item or a thing that is following multiple steps through a system, and you just want to work out who's doing what, where, and when. So you could, for example, use this in a logistics context. Context can be complex or non-complex, but just as a method, this is probably more widely applicable than just to hospitals and hospital waste management. And yeah, so I hope I've given you a snapshot of how we can really unpack our system to understand all the behaviors that are involved in it and their interconnectedness that then sets us up well to basically move forward with our project and make really informed decisions of where we want to focus on moving forward. Thank you.
That was a brilliant presentation, Lena. And every time I hear about your thesis research and just the sheer complexity of it, I'm always blown away by how many behaviors you've identified.
Thank you.
It's so incredible. And I mean, the questions actually reflect this. You have a plethora of questions waiting for you in the Q&A box of lots of people interested in your research. So thank you, Lena. Up next, we have, last but not least, Jennifer Macklin, who is a senior researcher at BehavioursWorks and leads our circular economy research in the environment portfolio. Jennifer's been at BehavioursWorks for 6 years and really focuses on circular economy policy and waste and consumption broadly as well, but also business models and consumer behaviour. So without further ado, over to you.
Thanks, Kavya. Yeah, really great to be here and wonderful to see so much interest in something that obviously interests us so much, this question about how can we actually use behavioural science to go beyond how it's traditionally conceived, I think, of, maybe persuasively encouraging people to do different behaviours, to really think about how we can use those same tools in behavioural science to actually shift whole broad systems. And so, as Lena was saying, she was kind of showing an approach to understanding a very contained system, or a very small system in terms of a single hospital. And as an example, to contrast, we wanted to show what it looks like to kind of do a similar thing at a really high level. And so I'm going to share about some of the work that we've done looking at Australia's system of production and consumption. So basically Australia's economic system. And to show how behavioural science tools can actually be used at that system level to really focus on where we might want to intervene to create that systems change. And so I am going to talk about a piece of work that actually came from our responsible consumption mission. And we were tasked by our government partners and the Australian, New South Wales and Victorian government to apply behavioural science to the question of getting people to consume more responsibly and more sustainably. And particularly out of some of the early work that we had done, this focus on wanting consumers to adopt these circular economy behaviours. So to actually get more people doing these actions so that their consumption impact and the material footprint of Australia's consumption would come down. And so, we faithfully went into this project thinking, okay, well, how can behavioural science help improve responsible consumption? And one of the things that we do once we've defined the behaviours is try and understand what are the barriers to those behaviours. And when we were doing the research, what we found was that there were some internal barriers to things about, people's perceptions, around, secondhand items or items made from recycled content or items that have been repaired. There were some issues around awareness and knowledge, but there were many, many more behaviours barriers to these behaviours that were actually, as Liam was talking about, systemic barriers. So barriers that existed beyond the individual person that had to do, with the massive amounts of advertising that are, bombarded with every day, that are always trying to tempt us away from some of these more responsible behaviours, a complete lack of options or ability to actually determine if, an item is more durable than another item, if it's made with, recycled content or recycled content from Australia rather than overseas. So real difficulties for people to actually do these behaviours. And what we kind of concluded out of this research is that at the moment, trying to do behaviour change, using behavioural science to do behaviour change to get consumers to do these behaviours more frequently was just not going to get us very far, because actually the system is working against people adopting these behaviours. And when we really looked at all of these barriers and we started to say, well, maybe we could pick a different audience to focus on, we thought about well, if we want people to buy items secondhand, maybe we could look at retailers, and how they could help their customers buy secondhand. But we realized that there was a whole range of different stakeholders who were implicated in making these behaviours more likely to happen. And so we realized that we really needed to zoom out away from consumers and really understand this entire system of production and consumption. And we thought about, we have systems thinkers at BehavioursWorks and at our broader institute, Monash Sustainable Development Institute, people who look at transitions. And we thought about the ability to make this into a systems thinking project. But what we realized was that behavioural science can bring insights into systems and look at systems and still provide really practical, useful tools for understanding the complexity of a system and then taking really practical action. And we found that in the past, sometimes the systems thinking on its own can lead our partners to feel a bit paralyzed by the complexity of the problem. And behavioral science actually brings tools to allow us to understand and acknowledge that complexity, and then still develop practical things that can be done. And so that's what we did. We used a form of system mapping, but it's behavioural system mapping, to actually map out the behaviours that are actually underlying these consumption behaviours. And, Lena was very zoomed in and, had over 180 behaviours. We stayed very zoomed out. We did not think about different types of contexts or different types of materials. We were just looking at the different actions of different stakeholders. And we ended up with 130 different actions that stakeholders in Australia's systems of production and consumption could take across all of those range of actions. And we actually created this map, and this map exists, and you can go and actually, zoom in and look at the different stakeholders who are related to some of the specific actions if you're particularly interested, and also see how those stakeholders themselves are connected to each other, and how they together enable and produce the conditions that allow consumers to do this, or don't, as is often the case at the moment. And one of the things that we did was we took these behaviours, and we had 130 behaviours, and we were like, okay, we now understand how complex this system is, how interconnected the decisions are. And we know the barriers that consumers face. We've done some work on the barriers that businesses face to adopt circular economy behaviours, but we still want to create change. We want to change the system so that we can enable these behaviours that we want to happen. And so what we needed to do was we had a whole range of stakeholders in this project. We had our government partners, and we were working with other partners as well in the civil sector, in other research centres, and in businesses and industry. So we wanted to really see if we could prioritise some parts of this system that needed to shift in order to make the whole system perform better. And this was a really useful kind of approach, because often when you do sort of traditional behavioural science, people will think about criteria about, like, what's the impact that this particular behaviour will have on the problem. And that's really useful if you want to, create some measurable change, in a discrete period of time. But what we were really interested in was long-term systems transformation. So where in this system could we find these points of intervention that if we could intervene and make change happen in one part, it would sort of ripple or flow through to a whole range of other parts of the system and enable other people to adopt the changes. So we actually used, some mapping metrics to understand where these key points are. And what we were able to do was basically rank all of these behaviours by their system influence. So if somebody did a particular behaviour, how many other behaviours in the system would become easier or more likely because someone took that particular behaviour? And where we ended up was with kind of a real clear standout. You can see how much, this is all, these are relative rankings. You can see how much higher this one behaviour by government is compared to all other behaviours in the system. And we were, as Liam talked about, we were thinking about all our different audiences, and we were thinking about politicians, and business and things like that. And the core behaviour was a policy action. So we actually needed government to take action. We needed them to implement a policy to mandate minimum design standards for products that are produced here or imported. And you can see that this one action, if governments would take it, flows through to a whole range of different actors by different stakeholders, actions by different stakeholders that actually influence all 8 of our final behaviours. And so that one change would unlock a huge amount of systems transformation. Across these other 10 behaviours, it was interesting that there was actually a few themes that emerged, and they actually focus on 4 different actions, but with multiple stakeholders working together to produce these changes. So the first one, as I said, was the minimum standards. There was another cluster of these really influential behaviours around extended producer responsibility. So product stewardship and extended producer responsibility, actually having industries set this up and then ensure that they actually included reuse and repair in their understanding of their responsibility for their products, not just what we have at the moment, which is collecting them and then trying to keep them out of landfill by recovering some of the materials and recycling some of the materials. And then another part of the system around retailers and how they actually might keep responsibility of their products and actually take them back, so that it is no longer the consumer's responsibility for what to do with a product when they no longer want it or when it stops working. So actually having industry involved in getting back products that are still working, that still have value. And then finally, a bit of a full kind of behaviour around organisational consumers prioritising durability in their procurement. And it was really interesting that there were not any personal consumption behaviours anywhere near the top of this system. As Liam said, the consumption can have an impact. What you buy can send a message to business, but generally the efforts that have been successful are when advocacy organisations or civil organisations have developed advocacy campaigns that actually bring a whole range of people together to try and boycott or to choose a particular product to send a message. And so again, it's actually the advocacy, but this time advocacy to business, that is actually the powerful part, rather than the individual choices, which are so hard to make them add up in our current system. And so what this project really did was enable us to really diagnose this system and say, where do we need the changes to happen? But once we've identified them, by using a behavioural science approach and having mapped the behaviours and understanding who it is and what they need to do, we now have behavioural science tools to say, well, what are the barriers to governments mandating minimum design or import standards? So we can use behavioural science to go to the next step and say, what are the barriers? And then how could we intervene? What is likely to change the behaviour of each of these actors? So rather than leaving behavioural science aside because we wanted to think big picture and going into the really big systems thinking tools, we can actually use behavioural science and keep that really practical approach of, what is the behaviour? What are the barriers? What is something that we could do to overcome those barriers and make that behaviour more likely, but apply it to actually creating systems change. And as part of this, we identified, across these 3 years and these government partners, that ideally was meant to be about responsible consumers, that actually 8 of the top 10 priorities focus on government and industry responsibilities around those kind of 4 things. And so we really identified that what we needed was the systems change and these parts of the system to change in order to enable that ultimate behaviour change that we want to see. And we also were able to map out all of the behaviours for different groups so that we could also enable other stakeholders to understand where they could impact in the system, even if they didn't, fall in these top 4, which behaviours were going to be really influential for a whole range of stakeholders. And so again, trying to get that ripple effect to help people all work towards the same goal and getting that same systems transformation.
Thank you so much, Jen. Every time I see your presentations, I just learn so much, and just a wizard at systems thinking. So brilliant. And again, you've, like Lena, received a plethora of questions and comments in the Q&A forum. So thank you so much. And I hope that at the end of this session, you've all seen sort of the variety of projects that we've done in this space around systems, and sort of the way that behavioural science really complements systems thinking and systems change. We've had so many wonderful questions from people all throughout the Q&A forum, and all 3 of our presenters are frantically trying to respond to all the questions. If you do have any further questions, please do chuck them in the chat. But if it's okay, Jennifer, I might shout out 1 or 2 of these questions and have you answer in real time. And so one of the questions from Tim is, were you able to identify case studies or examples of the high impact behavioural changes that you identified through the systems mapping?
Yeah, definitely. So we kind of came to this understanding of needing to take the systems approach quite late in this project. So it was a 3-year project, and this kind of systems piece was the last 6 months of 3 years, because we had dived really deep down into some of these consumer change problems of, really trying to unpack them. But we definitely, one of the values of the stakeholder approach that we did was that we brought a lot of circular economy stakeholders who already had experience of individual businesses doing things. So there's a number of, for example, retailers who are offering take-back schemes. IKEA is just one of those who in Sydney is piloting a take-back scheme where you can sell your unwanted IKEA furniture back to IKEA. They will actually buy it off you and then they sell it back again to their other consumers. We have a couple of other things like Patagonia and things where you could actually donate or give your unwanted items back and they would repair them and on-sell them. So there was individual case studies of retailers doing things. There are definitely examples overseas, for example, of the policy. So, Europe has their eco-design directive that has minimum standards around things. My favorite thing is when I buy, an electronic item from Belkin, and it says this has a warranty of 5 years in the United States, but only in the EU, but only 2 years if you're anywhere else in the globe, because they have to make sure that it lasts for 5 years in the EU because of the standards, but they don't have to do that anywhere else. So we collected a lot of these examples from our stakeholders to kind of provide some of these practical, I guess, as you said, case studies that can illustrate how these changes can happen in Australia.
Brilliant. We have another question for you, Jennifer, but actually I think it's a question that both Lena and Liam can also speak to, and I'd be keen to hear all of your thoughts. This is a question from Oscar. Regarding government mandating EPR being the top behavioural change lever, it's the second part of the question that I think is relevant to all of you. Do you have any insights into how to compel governments to take action?
Well, I'll answer very briefly, and then I think it is worth handing over to Liam. But we were working with government partners on this research and presenting back these recommendations. And like I said, in a very, boiling behavioural science down to a very simplistic process. If you understand what the behaviour is and then what are the barriers, why is that behaviour not happening? And then you can come up with solutions. And one of the things that was really clear, about policy, for example, is that there are a number of barriers that governments face in implementing policy that will have an initial cost to a massive section of, in this case, industry. And if you think about that kind of flowchart that Liam showed us before from Connor's PhD, that idea that unless citizens are demanding this from politicians, it's really hard for politicians to lead when there are going to be pushback from vested interests. And so what we have kind of discovered is working out, well, what are those barriers and how do we overcome them? In this particular case, it is that lack of general understanding and industry, the potential for industry pushback. And so part of what we can do in order to get the government to take that action is to then build this policy acceptance amongst individuals and amongst business, which is part of what MSDI has been doing with our circular economy labs. And we're seeing a whole range of stakeholders all working towards this effort and starting to see some of those flow through in the circular economy framework. But Liam, more broadly, interested in your insights.
I'm just going to apologise. I was just typing a response to someone, so I missed the question. Was it how do we make governments?
Yeah. Do you have any insights into how to compel governments to take action? A really tough question, Liam.
So, I mean, we could compel them, I guess, through who we vote for, and that's sort of one of the points I made in my presentation. I think, if a party runs with a particular platform and they get endorsed by the electorate, that's a way of giving them a mandate. I mean, the citizenry itself can't mandate a government to do anything, I don't think, particularly. But certainly through the voting process is one. But I was listening to Jen's response. I think the key is kind of, I think we need to work with government. I think behavioural approaches can really help government understand what the blockers are in their system and where policy might want to lead in order to enable things to happen and release behaviours or enable behaviours to happen much more easily. So I think generally speaking, the work we do is inside the tent. and rather than being sort of, activists outside the tents. Not all the work we do, but we certainly, the vast majority is about trying to help governments do their job in a way that incorporates behavioural science in order to help. Yeah. So I'm not really answering the question. I don't think we can mandate the government to do anything. I'd like to be able to, but I don't think we can. But if we can work with them, I think it get us a long way there.
Thanks, Liam. I believe we have time for one final question before we wrap up our session today. And this question is for Jen once again, and it's a question from Anna. And I think it's a nice one to end on. And the question is that it's so often that the individual is blamed, particularly in the recycling space. And this research is so useful. How much of an impact do you think your research has had, and are you optimistic? Oh, Jen, I think you might still be on mute. There we go.
Yeah. Look, it's an amazing question, and it's really interesting that you asked that question right now, because I just did an interview with one of my colleagues who is trying to understand the impact of some of the systems transformation work that the MSDI, our broader institute, is currently doing. And I remember at the end of this project, because like I said, this systems piece was like the last 6 months, and probably actually we only did the actual work in the last 3 months of this 3-year program. And so we did all of this work, we did up the final report, and then we handed it over, and then our partnership was over. And so we still have relationships, but we didn't have this ongoing partnership to see the work. And it did get a little bit lost at the time. And at the time I was thinking, oh gosh, were we really able to have much impact through that work? We came up with a lot of insights. We shared them with a lot of people, and a lot of people were really interested in them. Some of those people online right now, I saw you in the participant list. But what's really interesting is how it keeps coming back, and how I keep seeing it being used in different ways. And so we presented this this work, to our government partners. We were particularly, the final conclusion, for example, was that the Australian government would mandate minimum design standards. But as part of doing the work, we obviously then were able to share it with the CMAG, the Circular Economy Ministerial Advisory Group. These kind of things appeared in the reports that went to them, and they finally now appeared in the Productivity Commission inquiry and in the framework that government has, the Australian government has released. But we've also got state governments now coming to talk to us, particularly about durability, and saying, well, we can't mandate this particular thing, but we can see how important durability is, and maybe there's other policy tools that we could bring. And so we're doing some work with one particular state government, which hopefully will be shared at some point, not public at the moment, but to see, well, how could a state government intervene to try and increase the durability of a particular product line? And then some of the other work around product stewardship, for example, has come out, and we've been doing talks and contributing to some of the things around the Product Stewardship Centre of Excellence. And so the part of the thing with systems transformation is it takes time. It takes a real time to shift systems. And particularly for behavioural scientists, when we're used to being able to put an intervention in and then see the change, it's really difficult. But so this work kind of wrapped up about 2.5 years ago, and we're just starting now to see a whole lot of these changes coming through. So it does happen, and it is happening, but it's probably a lot slower than we would all ideally like it to be.
Brilliant answer, Jen. Thank you so much. And that pretty much perfectly brings us to time. And so I might wrap up the session there. Again, just a really big thank you to all of you for attending and for the wonderful variety of questions. And especially for those of you who are working on wicked or complex problems. While these challenges don't have an easy behavioural science solution, hopefully from today's session, you've gleaned some insights about how we can do things differently by adopting a systems thinking perspective. Our next webinar in the series will be titled Breaking the Mold, Harnessing Resistance to Change. And this will be on the 31st of July. Our next slide actually has a little QR code if you're interested in joining. And this third webinar will really be exploring resistance to change in organizations. Again, thank you so much. A really big thank you to our presenters, Liam, Jen, and Lena. Thank you so much. And it was lovely to see you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.